playing music for over 50 years. Okay? And so we've got a great evening tonight. He's going to show, obviously, by example, either with the piano that I didn't tune in time, but his guitar.
No. So I got interested in the blues as a kid. I grew up in Philadelphia until I was 16. We used to have records of the Kingston Trio during the early 60s and that kind of thing. It was it was a lot of fun. I can remember going over to the record store at the local mall, which was an outdoor mall, which was walkable from my house, maybe a mile or two. And I picked up a record by Josh White, who was a East Coast blues singer who worked his way over to Chicago. This was just a really kind of a lucky phenomena for me because they had Josh White play with some blues musicians from Chicago who were world famous later. Rice Miller, Sonny Boy Williamson was there. I think Mance Lipscomb was playing piano. I'll do one of those songs, or just to give you a feel of it. I was feeling mighty bad. My baby said, good morning, Lord, it made me mad, 'cause I was evil, evil-hearted me. Lord, I was down and right evil, evil as man can be. Fed me breakfast, Lord, she kissed me at the door. I turned around, looked at her, said, ain't coming back no more, 'cause I'm evil, evil-hearted me. Lord, I'm just down and right evil, evil as man can be. That's kind of the feel of it anyway. My brother went to college. He was 6 years older than me, and when he came back, he had a guitar. And when he got upgraded to another guitar, I got his old one. So it was fun for me, and I just kind of got into that. But I went to Florida, and this was in the mid-60s, and I was going to the Deep South, the live oak trees and the Spanish moss, and driving down there, and it was just a very different culturally for me. And blues is part of that. I played in a rock band in Florida. We were the runner-up in the Florida JC's Orlando Battle of the Bands and stuff. Let me tell you some things I've found out about the blues, because we have this tradition in this country of bringing slaves here, which was happening all over the world, but they were forced here against their will, and they were forced here to go to places like Spanish cultures too. But the English were tougher. The English really thought of slavery as, if you have a slave, they have no rights whatsoever. They're like a piece of furniture. And this is just how the English did it. the other side of the coin is you have this situation which is struck me, and that is you have these people that are kind of put in a vice, and the vice is turned down, and you have music coming out of them, and it's a music that's very interesting. And the thing is to know about, and this is what I learned later, African musicians have a larger vocabulary. They have more notes in their system than Westerners do. And they're searching for those notes, which is why it's irresistible to people like me, because they're looking for their notes. They're sliding, they're sliding from one note onto another. They're bending the harmonica. The other thing is the instruments they can play, they have to be able to afford. And like harmonica is a great instrument for the black people because it was cheap. You could own one for less money. The other thing you could do is anyway, the music of Africa is more, to us, a lot more primitive. It's not as organized in the same way that Western culture is. We have, 7 or 8 little notes, and we have the minor and the major and the flatted. But in African musicians, they have different things that constitute value. And it's just different. And when you combine it with Western instruments, it makes it interesting and irresistible, to me anyway. So African musicians play a lot of rhythmic instruments. They play a lot of drums. There's a thing called an earth bow, which is where you take a sapling, next to the sapling you dig a hole, put like a gut onto the tip of the sapling, bend it over, run it through a skin that's over the hole, and pluck it. And when you pluck it, it changes the length of the gut and turns a different sound. It's like when you're playing slide, you're searching for those notes that are in between the Western notes. So it's something that's irresistible to me anyway, and something that's interesting to look at. When you have a harmonica and you bend the note, you're trying to search for the notes between the notes, like. The reed instruments are particularly interesting because you can bend the notes. There are a couple areas of the blues that I'd like to hit on. One of the things, when I was a kid, Elizabeth Cotton was a folk singer who was a domestic in Philadelphia, a black lady from, I'm not sure if the Carolinas or where, but she was, she wrote a song that kind of demonstrates the East Coast school. Now, I'm not going to get into this too heavily, but basically, people that analyze the blues look at a couple things. There's kind of the East Coast, Piedmont area of the blues. You have the Delta area of the blues, which is the Mississippi Delta, which In fact, I was jokingly thinking about saying, well, you know, this whole talk is really about the blues came up with the Mississippi on the backs of slaves. That's it, you know. But we used to, buddies of mine in college, we used to go down to Cambridge all the time and buy used records by blues guys. And the blues was really great to get into because a lot of those records were like cutouts, and you could get them for like 10 cents on the dollar. If you were into John Lee Hooker, who had 1 million albums, you could get them pretty inexpensively. But the music was really very interesting. And then you have the Texas blues style. So let me do a little, I'll try to do some East Coast. Some East Coast guys would be the Reverend Gary Davis, who is a black itinerant singer and preacher from the Carolinas who moved to New York City. He was blind. He had several students, of which some you may recognize as Larry Johnson, or Dave Bromberg was a student of his. He used to play on the streets, just like Josh White used to play on the streets of Chicago. In fact, Josh White he would have songs where he was stuffing his shoes with straw to keep warm in Chicago. I mean, Chicago is unbearable in the winter, especially if you're a street guy, a street musician. But let me see if I can do a little. This is a song I learned as a kid, and I haven't played it for years, but let me try it. It's called Freight Train. Things if you're trying to play blues, one thing that's very important is you have a bass going. You know, you're kind of, I don't know if you picked up on that, but like that. You know, I'm going. The thing about one of the things that's very important is in blues, and what makes it so irresistible is rhythm. Rhythm is the key, and it's consistent. And you know, when you think about it, like I can remember when I started playing piano. Dr. John talks about this African rhythm, and it goes. Bo diddly rhythm. You know, he would say, you know, it's a 1,000-year-old beat, and probably communicated. Who knows what it communicated, but it's something of interest. was born in the Delta. For me, that's where the Schuylkill meets the Delaware. Yeah, I was born in the Delta, way out on that shady grove. Kind of a muddy water style. Bad luck, child. Gypsy woman told me, I can be your mother's bad luck, child. You having a good time now? There'll be trouble after a while. I went to see the gypsy woman, give my fortune read. Said, go back home, child. Look under the bed. Gypsy woman told me, little Malcolm, your mother's bad luck, child. You having a good time now? There'll be trouble after a while. The Texas style is something, the Delta style has a lot of that kind of like, and I'll do some more of that too. The Texas style is more like Lightning Hopkins and Collins, which evolved into Stevie Ray Vaughan and Jimmy Vaughan. They picked up on that. It's just like the East Coast Piedmont style was picked up, which evolved into, you know, when you get into that finger picking, that like, oh, that kind of stuff like, let's see. I'm doing, normally you do 3 finger picking, but I'm going to do 2 because I'm cheating tonight. rain a whole lot more, 'cause I got them deep river blues. Let the rain shine on, let them rain on, 'cause I got them deep river blues. That's the Doc Watson style, which Doc Watson, Merle Travis were guys who really picked up on that kind of bluegrass picking, where the beginning of what evolved into later country music. That kind of style. When you study that style and you learn that Merle Travis and those guys learned how to pick from a couple black Kentucky coal miners, it's time to go into the blues. Let me look at my cheat sheet here. I was going to do, why don't we do, I'll do another song and we'll take a little breather and I'll play a little piano or something. This is one thing that, I don't know if I can pull this off. I was going to give you a little Delta, another aspect of the Delta blues, and that's Howlin Wolf. If you haven't listened to Howlin Wolf, do yourself a favor. It's a shame because I worked with Muddy Waters when I was in college. I just opened up a show for him, but it was like a mind-bending experience to hear the modern Muddy Waters blues machine. Was just, and I got into Howlin Wolf after that, and Howlin Wolf unfortunately died before I could see him, but his songs were, there were two competing bands in Chicago, in the south side of Chicago, Muddy Waters being one and Howlin Wolf being the other, and they were both masterful. Chuck Berry, who was recorded by Chess Records, if you get a chance to see that Cadillac Records, that's kind of it's a good representation of what was happening at that time, which was explosive musically. It was just amazing. And Chuck Berry, who could come out with things that really the teeny boppers of the day loved. They couldn't get enough of that. Sweet 16 and all that stuff. Up in the morning and out to school. Man, I can remember when I grew up, my older brother and sister, who were 6 and 9 years old, only listened to the Black AM station in Philadelphia, and all that stuff was blasting through. It was like wonderful. But Howlin Wolf was very cool. There's a great record. I sold all my blues records, but there's a great record of Howlin Wolf recorded in London, and it was kind of like Muddy Waters did the same thing. Chess Records had these guys. They were really worshipped in England, which is why we weren't into it at the time, but we got into it later. And Muddy Waters and Howlin Wolf both did these records in London, and they're killer. Howlin Wolf is showing Eric Clapton how to play some blues stuff, and it was just mind-bending. But Howlin Wolf does something like this. little red rooster to lays the crow for day. Keep all the hens in the hen house upset in every way. Now if you see my red rooster, won't you please go and drive him home? Yeah, if you see my little red rooster, won't you please go and drive him home? I ain't had no peace in the barnyard since that rooster of mine been gone. Between a couple songs, Blues After Hours being one of them, which used to be the theme song for May Kramer on the blues show that came out of Boston on GBH on Friday nights, maybe? Anyway, I got interested in, one of the things I was interested in because a friend of mine, when I first got a piano in my house, you know, if you spend all this money to get a piano in your house, every time you walk by, you say, geez, I gotta learn that thing, you know, figure this out. But I got a friend of mine who's a piano player gave me an instructional video from Dr. John. And, you know, it was very cool, it was super interesting. But one of the things he did was, and I wanted to learn this, so I developed a song around learning this one riff, which was a Professor Longhair riff. Now, if you haven't heard Professor Longhair, he's the guy who kind of invented rock and roll piano. All those triplets like that, you know, all that kind of stuff came out of Professor Longhair. And I'll do another song that was influenced by Professor Longhair. It goes something like this. He outsold Elvis, he outsold Little Richard, he outsold Buddy Holly. You know, he was the king of the universe in the early 50s and dramatically influenced music. But the riff I was talking about was, and I tried to write a song around it just so I could learn it. And once I got it, I realized you could do it in a couple different keys. One of the things that's interesting on the piano is, unlike the guitar where every fret you go up, the fingerings are the same, you're just going up a half step. On piano, you have all these black notes and these white notes and everything's jumbled up. And you have to learn different keys in it. It's not the same fingering for every key. And the thing that's also interesting about it is when you start playing with the horn players like to play in certain keys. Like on guitar, if you're a blues guy, you like to play in E and G and A, maybe B. If you're a horn player, you like to play in the flat keys, so you're playing in B flat. You know, keys that are easier to play on horns, and it's much more interesting. The guy who played with me here at the brunch, Amity Castanel, is a Bourbon Street musician. In fact, it was funny because we got a late start for that brunch. I think we were supposed to start at 11, but people thought I'd be here around 10, and I got here 10:30 or 20 up. I got a phone call, a nervous phone call. Hey, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm waiting for my ride. But I mentioned to Amity, I said, let's get set up and start playing before the bullets start flying, just jokingly. And he said, Malcolm, man, don't talk like that. He said, you know, when you play on Bourbon Street about 4 a.m., that really happens. So I said, geez, I'm sorry. Anyway, this is kind of a Professor Longhair riff that I learned to try to get this one thing. You're not going to find that in Western music, you know? That's another thing you're not going to find in Western music, that kind of... Because there's... hitting those two notes. That's a Professor Longhair riff. That other thing that was doing that kind of like that. You see what's happening there? That's what's irresistible to me. It's the kind of thing where you're sliding off a black note onto a white note. And what African musicians are searching for, because it's in their musical vocabulary and it's not in Western man's, is the notes between the notes. So when you're going, it's like the slide on the guitar. It's getting those notes in between the frets, which is so interesting and so cool. I was trying to think, I just had something like that. that, oh yeah, I was going to do a little of this. What draws me to some of this stuff is it's like the gospel sound and reaching for the notes between the notes. That guy right there up on the wall, George Whitefield, he was the one who headed up a movement, the Great Enlightenment, I guess. I'm not sure if the Great Awakening, maybe. But you know, in the 18th century, when a lot of people weren't able to read or write, you know, the gospel and the story of Jesus and the Bible and reading and writing and learning was all owned by the monarchy, really, by the aristocrats. And Whitefield was the one who, among other things, he started the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. His old church was the one that became the University of Pennsylvania. In fact, Ben Franklin said when Whitefield spoke at Christ Church in Philadelphia, you could hear him in Trenton. I wanted to play you something else. I was trying to think. Well, let's do.
Can you just quickly, or not, but describe just the three three segments of the blues. You said Philly, Delta, and Texas. And,
Well,
and just break
yeah,
that down a little
Piedmont. The Piedmont is kind of the East Coast school, and then I did that song,
Yeah.
Freight Train. That's kind of like the East Coast school, which is multiple finger picking, and that drifted into what became the early country music and the bluegrass music. So Merle Travis, Doc Watson, and Chet Atkins. Chet Atkins was one of the greatest guitar players who ever lived. Were all part of this because Merle Travis, who started the other guys on their path, was a guy who learned how to pick from a couple Black Kentucky coal miners, which is interesting because they have a style. They're just it was irresistible, and they loved it, and they learned it. But the East Coast, Piedmont, is kind of a school of blues, and you have people passing between these different areas, but that's what the academics look at. They look at kind of the East Coast because that's different stylistically. But you have Josh White and one of the greatest guitar players who was from an East Coast guy but went to the Chicago Delta style, was Luther Johnson. Luther Johnson, not the one we hear of today. That's Luther Johnson #2. The first Luther Johnson was a short guy, balding head, who played lead guitar with Muddy Waters Band, and he was from the East Coast but went to Chicago. Same with Josh White. The Delta blues is like Muddy Waters, Howlin Wolf, Sonny Boy Williamson, John Lee Hooker, and that style is kind of picked up and goes to Chicago and is the early foundation of rock and roll. Then the Texas blues is like Lightnin' Hopkins. Lightnin' Hopkins plays a lot of, he'll do things like I don't want no woman, man, if her hair ain't no longer than mine. I don't want no woman, man, if her hair ain't no longer than mine. She ain't nothing but trouble, yeah. She'll have you buying wigs all the time. So that's the Texas style.
All right.
And they also kind of intermingle.
We got a couple questions over here.
Now,
Yes.
you haven't mentioned B.B. King or his contribution, and of course Lucille.
Well, yeah.
What's your guitar called?
Yeah. B.B. King, that kind of. I got this record from my brother when I was in the service, and I practically.
It's gone.
You know, it's funny. When I lived in Central Florida, they had a movie theater in downtown Orlando, and it was the big, dramatic theater with balconies and stuff. And later on, when I was in the service, I went down there on leave, and my buddy said, "Let's go see B.B. King. He's playing at this theater downtown," which was the big dramatic theater that had, the Sound of Music. And we go there. We saw B.B. King, and they had Lowenbrow on tap, and you could get wine. And in those days, you could smoke in the theater.
In the history of music, have you delved into the history of Little Malcolm and the Malfunctions at any time? Because I'm going to lead into that if you haven't. And maybe 6 months or a year later, one day Malcolm said, "Hey, I got together with my whole group. It's Little Malcolm and the Malfunctions, and
Funk being the operative word.
we got a gig at Michael's. I got a gig at Michael's, Friday night. Maybe you and Betty like to come by." So we get to Michael's, and the second floor is full. The place is rocking, and we're kind of working our way through the crowd. And I said to Betty, I didn't know Malcolm had a black lead singer, for God's sake. He is ripping the house down. And I get up there, and it's Malcolm. Malcolm is wearing his bass jeans, his corduroys, his Harris tweed jacket. And if you could give us anything of the days of Malcolm and the Malfunctions, I'd love it.
Let's see. I think we used to do this to him. Sounds a lot more full with a full band. John Lee Hooker. Yes, sir.
Of all the blues guitarist live concerts you've seen in your lifetime, what would you say are your top 3 favorite? Like favorite performances, just favorite players,
I'll tell you exactly. Yeah, I
Okay.
appreciate that question coming from a musician. One of my favorite was I'd gotten out of the service. I'd gone back to college. I was going to college in New Hampshire. They had a show. They hired Bonnie Raitt. Bonnie Raitt had couple records out on Warner Brothers Records. The opening act was Luther Johnson, the first one I was telling you about, the guy who was East Coast, who went to Chicago and played with Muddy Waters. And he came out there, and they had this thing going on, and the band was doing that, and it was just really cool. And Luther Johnson came out, and they got this, that was kind of something like I was playing. Something simple. And Luther Johnson came out and went, You know, and everybody went, and then went, and you know, it was just mind-blowing. It was absolutely mind-blowing, and he just ripped the place to pieces. Ironically, Bonnie Raitt was hired with a full band, and she just showed up with Freebo, the bass player at the time, and she was practically booed off the stage. And she had like a large following at the time. It was kind of sad, but this guy Luther Johnson, the first one and the second one, they're both great, but the first one was just a killer guitar player. And he could, you know, the beauty of it is, and it's very interesting, it's not how many notes you play. It's not like, you know, some of these rock guitar players are like all over the place. It's not that. It's just playing it with some feeling, you know what I mean? You can play one note. He came out and played one note for 5 bars or whatever it was. And just everybody was like, ooh, yeah, this is it, you know? So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You were
Yeah.
great, thank you.
Thank you.
On a closing note, I said this would go for about 40 minutes. It's double that. You didn't even realize it. Thank you so much, Malcolm.
Thank you.
Here's to you. Appreciate it. Hope you
Yeah.
come back. And thanks to all of you guys.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.